Hi guys, so in this video we're going to be looking at how to spray water-based base coat. We'll be using Lessenol water-based base coat along with the IWATA AZ3 HTE-S. Okay, so we've got our test panel back in the booth. This is the same test panel that we've been using so far in this series, and all we've done with this test panel is give this a full sand down with a P1000. Now prep wise, it's going to be pretty much the same as the base coat apart from one thing, which will be the water-based cleaner. So for the first part, we are just going to make sure again that this panel is fully blown off, just the same as we did with the solvent base coat video. We're going to make sure that the panel stand's blown off, that the panel's blown off inside and out, to make sure that any loose debris anywhere that could be disturbed during the spraying process is completely off that panel. Then we're going to move on to the actual cleaning of the panel. Now with this being a waterborne paint, if you want to use panel wipe, then we need to do the actual solvent panel wipe part first. So here we've got our usual solvent panel wipe. This is exactly the same panel wipe as we used in the solvent base coat video as well. And we're going to give this panel a really nice scrub down now with this panel wipe to make sure that any oil based or chemical based contaminants are completely removed from the surface of the panel, and give this a good pre-clean before we get the water-based degreaser on this panel and give it a clean ready to spray the waterborne base coat down. Now with solvent based panel wipe, I don't tend to wipe on and wipe off because I find that especially in a booth, if we've got the heating on, they do evaporate rather quickly, as you can see there. So I don't normally feel the need to wipe on and wipe off. Now the waterborne degreaser is a different story. This is the Lessenol waterborne degreaser. I will spray the panel, I will spray the cloth, I'll give the panel a really good scrub down, and then I will wipe this off, because if the cleaner on the surface has trapped any water-based contaminants of any sort, or any dirt or anything like that, and we just let it dry out on the panel, then obviously that's going to stay stuck to the surface of the panel as a bit of residue. So once I've given this a really good scrub over with the waterborne degreaser, I then turn the cloth inside out onto a dry section, and then we're going to give it a real nice wipe over now to get as much of the leftover moisture off this panel as we can, and then the final little bit will just evaporate in the air and the warmth in the spray booth. Now for the colour for this, to change things up a little bit, I've used a Range Rover or Land Rover colour called Carpathian Grey. It's a nice dark grey, kind of like a gunmetal-y grey sort of colour. And again, we're going to be using this through the IWATA AZ3 HTE-S. Now, as far as drying the waterborne goes, the orange Welcome Dry is what we normally use, but they're about £50–60. So we're going to use the little air blower that you can get anything ranging from around about £5 to around about £20, just to show you guys that you can use waterborne in a more beginner environment. Now, that's the main difference, I would say, between solvent base and waterborne base paints, is waterborne does need to be dried using air movement, and ideally a little bit of warmth as well. But on this day I have switched the burner off on the booth, so the booth on this day is running about 10 degrees Celsius, so you can see for yourself that it is possible without heat. Now for the gun setup, we're going to use a full fan on the spray gun, the same as we did with the solvent base coat and also the clear coat. We're going to put this around about 2.5 turns out for the first coat, and again with the trigger depressed, we are going to set our air pressure for the water-based base coat to around about 25 psi. We don't really need anything higher than that for base coat. So to start off with, the same as any job, we're just going to use some air from the spray gun and the tack rag nice and gently, remembering what we went through in the solvent base coat stage, not to put any pressure on, because we don't want to put pressure on this tack rag and leave residue from the tack rag on this panel. So we just want to go nice and light over the panel. Now that little bit of primer there is just where we got a little bit of a scuff on this panel, so I just block that little bit of a scuff out, and then we put a little bit of primer over it. Now with the Lessenol water-based system, it does like a light first coat rather than going really heavy on the first coat. So we're just going to go round first and do the edges, and we're looking for around about a 70% coat. So we don't want it really wet, but we don't want it really dry either. We just want a 70% coverage coat, and that will give us then a nice grip coat to go on with a full wet coat on the next coat. So the same as before, we're just going around, we're going to catch all these hard to reach areas before we start on the main bulk of this panel, and then we're going to move across the main part of the panel. So for 70% coat, what I would do is just move that little bit further away and go that little bit faster. We're keeping the same sort of overlap around about a 50%, which as you can see is giving us a patchy but a sort of even 70% covered coat. Now once that's complete, I would say this is where the most important thing with Waterborne base coat comes in, is the drying process. Now one thing that I was always told as far as Waterborne paint goes is you don't want to blow directly at the panel, because at the moment that is very wet and it will stay wet for quite some time. So if you blow directly at that panel, you have a risk of pushing the paint around. So rather than blowing directly at the panel, blow along the length of the panel. It gives more of an airflow moving across the whole panel, and also it just gives that little bit of a less of a chance that you could agitate the paint on the surface of the panel. And just keep going with this. This took around about 10 minutes at 10 degrees to dry that panel down to a nice matte finish. Now you don't want a glossy finish still on the base coat, and you don't want a satin finish. You want a nice matte finish before you start putting the next coat on. Now usually if we've got the booth set to about 20-25 degrees, it would take less than 5 minutes to dry a coat, but obviously because we've got this turned off to give you DIY and beginner guys a bit more experience of how it will be for you, then it will take that little bit longer for things to dry, as it will in any case compared to doing it in a proper spray booth. So for this second coat, we're going around and we're going to go around and now give this a full wet coat, so a full covered wet coat. I've also opened the fluid up an extra half a turn on this coat, because we've got that nice first coat down to give us that extra little bit of grip, so we can go that little bit wetter on this particular coat. So as we're going along here, we're going to go again a nice tight even overlap, a nice even distance and a nice even speed to give us that nice uniform wet coat from top to bottom on this panel. Now it's a nice quick process with Waterborne base coat. A lot of people think it's going to be very different to solvent, but in many ways it's only really the drying that I find that is any different. And obviously because it's waterborne and not solvent based, there's a lot less chance of reactions or anything like that with previous paint on the panels, which is why I personally prefer to use Waterborne base coats. Now I dried that off camera. Again, it was around about 10 minutes. You can see there now we've got full coverage, it's nice and even. So all we're going to do now is do our drop coat or control coat, depending on what you call it. So the purpose of the drop coat is to make sure that there's no mottling in this panel, and to make sure that all the pearls and metallics in this paint are sat down nice and uniform and nice and even on the surface. So when we clear coat this up, we end up with a really nice even finish on the panel and a really nice looking colour. Now usually I would be in quite close when spraying base coat, but for the drop coat we're going to move back. We're going to keep the same gun settings, we're just going to move back a little bit, and we're just going to go for around about a 30% sort of dust coat over this panel. We don't want this wet, but at the same time we don't want this dry, because we don't want a rough finish when we've ended. And then I will come back and give it another 30% coat. So say we've got around about 60% coverage, and as you'll see in a second when I finish spraying this panel, it's kind of a mixture. It's kind of like half wet, half dry. It's not wet in any areas, but it's not dry in any areas. It's just a nice satin finish at the moment. That's going to give us a really nice even distribution on those pearls and metallics. And then again, before we even put clear coat on this, we need to make sure that again this is fully dried down, and make sure it is 100% dried down before we go into the clear coat application. So for the clear coat settings, again we are using the same gun. We are going to use a full fan. We are going to go 2.5 turns out on the fluid for the first coat, and with the trigger depressed we're going to set our air pressure at 2 bar, which will give us a nice big fan and give us a nice amount of paint flow, but not too much to start off with. Again, before we start this, we've just made sure that this is 100% dry and it's fully matte all over, and I'll just be very careful of this. Do make sure it is fully dry before you start tack ragging it or anything like that, because the last thing you want to do now is mess up this panel by not drying it fully or missing a little area on the panel. Then we are going to go into spraying this exactly the same as we did over the solvent base coat. So we're going to go around all the edges first, catching all these hard to reach areas, making sure we've sealed up all those edges all around the panel, and then we're going to go for a nice light wet coat on over the whole panel, and then we're going to come back then with a heavier wet coat on the panel to give us our final finish. Now personally, I find that clear coat does lay down a lot nicer over Waterborne than it does over solvent, and also after a bake there's less chance for us of the Waterborne pulling the paint back, because there's no solvents trapped under the surface, so it does tend to leave a nice flatter, smoother finish after a bake as well. So we're doing exactly the same as we did in the clear coat video. We're just concentrating on our speed, our distance, our overlap, and also the angle of the nozzle to the panel. We want to keep that at a nice 90-degree angle and parallel to the panel at all times. So we've just put that one nice wet coat down now, a nice light wet coat, and then I've just turned the fluid up to an extra half a turn. So we're at 3 turns now for the second coat. Now in between these coats I did leave that around 10 minutes to flash off, and then we're just coming across now with our second heavier wetter coat. Same again, just getting that nice overlap, but that extra half a turn on the fluid is just giving us that extra little bit of paint flow, and obviously because we've got that first coat down and it gave it something to stick to, we can put this second coat down that little bit heavier. And as you'll see here, this little beginner price range gun really does perform well. I can't fault the finish on this whatsoever. It's got a few nibs in it, but nothing that we couldn't polish out in the matter of a few minutes. And overall, I think this gun has done an outstanding job yet again. So in part 5, we're going to simulate a repair on the front edge of this wing so we can go through base coat blending. In the video we will include all the panel prep needed to blend base coat, and also all the steps that we need to go through to recolour that repair, blend our base coat, and then re-clear the panel. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. If you have, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, give it a share on social media, and if you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button. That's it for me for today, guys, and I'll see you again soon.